In the hard autumn of 1878, while every other homesteader along the Cannonball was stacking firewood and caulking cabins against the killing cold, Ryan was doing something that looked like pure madness. He just paid a failed cooper $6 for 50 wrecked barrels and was now dismantling them stave by stave, laying out a strange circle on the frozen ground. The neighbors called it suicide. With a pregnant wife and no second chance, he was about to gamble everything on a single terrifying question. Could a house with no corners teach a Dakota blizzard to simply roll over and leave his family untouched? This is Ryan, a man with no money, no lumber, and a family about to face a winter that had already killed stronger men than him. What he did have was 50 condemned whiskey barrels, a bankrupt cooper's handshake, and an idea so strange that passing wagons stopped just to stare. They called it the Round House, and everyone said it would bury him alive. Because on the open plains, the blizzard didn't just test your shelter. It hunted corners, and Ryan was building a home without a single one. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the man who dared to believe that a circle could save what a square could not. Ryan had arrived on the Cannonball 2 summers earlier with nothing but a worn-out mule and a deed signed under the Homestead Act. The land was flat and hard, good for grazing but merciless on the poorly prepared. Like most settlers, he had built a simple sod house, thinking it would be enough. But that first winter taught him otherwise. The snow didn't just fall on the prairie, it attacked. Driven by winds that screamed across hundreds of miles of open ground, drifts buried doorways and caved in roofs. Men froze to death less than 20 feet from their own cabins because the whiteout stole their sense of direction. By spring, Ryan knew he needed something different for his growing family. Yet the nearest timber stood a week's wagon ride away, and a proper plank house cost money he would never see. He was trapped between a killing winter and an empty pocket, and time was running out. Then he heard about the cooperage. Old Gideon Muldor had been the only barrel maker in 3 territories, supplying whiskey, salt pork, and flour barrels to every settlement along the Missouri River. But the railroad had changed everything. Cheap barrels now arrived by the carload from back east, and Gideon's hand-built oak casks were suddenly worth less than the sawdust on his floor. By September of 1878, the cooperage was bankrupt, the yard stacked high with rejected barrels that leaked, warped, or failed inspection. Gideon was preparing to burn the lot for firewood when Ryan walked in with $6 in his fist and a proposition that sounded like a joke. He wanted every condemned barrel left standing. Gideon stared at him, then laughed. He told Ryan the oak was half rotten. The staves were barely holding together, and even the whiskey makers wouldn't touch them. Ryan just nodded and said, "I ain't making a barrel." The old cooper's laughter died. He saw something in the younger man's eyes, desperation maybe, but also a strange kind of certainty. So for $6, a handshake, and a promise to help haul them, 50 condemned whiskey barrels changed ownership. The wagon ride back to the claim drew stares from every rider they passed. 50 barrels lashed together in a rattling heap looked like the world's worst supply run. Neighbors assumed Ryan had lost his mind. Some figured he'd found a secret whiskey stash and was about to get rich. But when they saw him prying the first barrel apart behind his sod house the next morning, carefully removing each curved oak stave and laying them in organized rows, confusion shifted to outright scorn. A man named Cranston, who ran a dry goods store in town, stopped his wagon to watch. "You fixing to build a house out of wet, rotten staves?" he called. Ryan didn't answer. He just kept pulling nails, separating the good oak from the splintered, running his hands along the grain like a carpenter reading a map. He could see something the others couldn't. A barrel was already a circle, and a circle was the only shape on earth that gave a relentless wind nothing to grab, no sharp corner to pound against, no flat wall to pile snow upon. It was not a shelter against the storm. It was an invitation for the storm to pass on by. The woman who shared his claim watched all of this from the doorway of their sod house. Her name was Ada. She was 5 months pregnant with their second child. Their son, Jacob, barely 6, helped where he could, carrying staves and handing his father tools with small, cold-reddened fingers. Ada had learned to trust her husband's stubbornness, but this was something else entirely. The prairie winter was a predator, and they were about to face it inside a structure made from a drunk, discarded barrel parts. At night, by the dim light of a grease lamp, she asked him the only question that mattered. Can it actually hold? Ryan paused, a stave across his knees as he shaped the curve with a drawn knife. It'll hold different, he said. Wind goes around. Snow can't pile if there ain't a flat wall to lean against. She didn't press further, not because she was convinced, but because they had no other choice. The wood they had was the wood they had. Winter was coming, and this crazy circle was better than sleeping under a wagon tarp for 3 months. Ryan worked through October, shaving each stave to interlock with the next, using iron hoops salvaged from the barrels to cinch the outer walls tight. The floor was pounded earth, the roof a shallow dome of woven branches and prairie grass, sealed with mud and lime. By the time the first hard frost arrived, the house was complete, a single round room, 12 feet across, with a small stove in the center and a chimney pipe poking through the roof. From the outside, it looked like a giant barrel lying on its side, half buried in the dirt. The neighbors called it the round house. It sounded like a polite way to say folly. Even Gideon Mulder, who had delivered the barrels, came back to see the finished product. He walked around it twice, knocked on the curved wall, then gave Ryan a look that was half respect and half pity. "You built a barrel without a bottom," he muttered. "Hope it holds better than mine did." He rode away shaking his head. But the true test came from a man named Hoke, an old mountain trapper who had spent 30 winters in territories far more savage than the Dakota Plains. Hoke had seen shelters fail in ways that turned men into frozen statues. When he rode through the settlement and saw the round house, he didn't laugh. He circled it slowly, studying the curved lines, the lack of corners, the way the wind already seemed confused as it brushed against the smooth oak. Then he crouched down and swept snow away from the base. He looked up at Ryan with rheumy eyes. "You got one problem," he said. "Ain't the shape. The shape's right, it's the door. It faces north." He pointed toward the dark horizon where the blizzards always bred. "Storm comes, that door won't get buried. It'll get ripped clean off. You'll be staring straight into the mouth of the devil with no way to stop it." Ryan felt the truth of it deep in his bones. He had been so focused on the walls, on the miraculous curve that would shed wind, that he had forgotten the one hole he had intentionally cut into the structure. The door faced the wrong direction, and the first blizzard would find it like a wound. He had maybe one day to fix it, to build a windbreak or an angled entryway that could deflect the gusts. But even as he started planning, the sky began to change. Iron-gray clouds stacked over the plains, and the temperature plummeted with a suddenness that stole the breath. The first blizzard of the season was rolling down from the Canadian flats, carrying with it the kind of cold that froze spit before it hit the ground. Ryan hammered frantically, building a protruding entry porch from leftover staves to catch the wind and send it sideways. But dusk came too fast. The wind rose to a shriek. Snow began falling not in flakes, but in a horizontal wall of white. Ada barricaded the children inside the roundhouse while Ryan made one last adjustment to the entry. As the storm hit full force, he tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to the door frame. Ada screamed over the roar, "You don't have to go out there." But he did, because if that door failed, the entire house would become a freezing tunnel, and the family inside wouldn't last the night. He opened the door and the blizzard surged in, a physical blow of ice and darkness. Then he plunged into the howling void, vanished from sight, and left his terrified wife clutching the rope that was now the only thread between her husband and the abyss. The first true test of the roundhouse had begun, and nothing was certain except the storm's absolute hunger for their lives. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. The moment Ryan stepped from the doorway, the blizzard swallowed him whole. One second he was a husband and father with a hammer in his frozen hand. The next he was a blind shape crawling through a white that had no direction. No up, no down. Only the endless sideways scream of ice. The rope around his waist stayed taut, and that was the only proof he was still connected to anything living. Ada stood just inside the door, feet braced, holding the rope with both hands. Jacob cried behind her, his small voice swallowed by the roar. She felt every jerk, every pause, every desperate lurch of her husband's body through the line. She knew that if the rope went slack, it meant he had fallen. If it went too tight and stayed that way, it meant the wind had pinned him. So she held on and prayed that the thin hemp would keep talking. Ryan crawled toward the north side of the roundhouse, where the half-finished entry porch stood exposed. The wind here was not wind. It was a wall of moving force. He had to lean his entire body into it just to stay upright. His beard had already frozen into a solid mask, his eyelashes glued together with ice. But he found the staves he had stacked there earlier, felt the iron hoops he had left lying beside them. Working blind, he forced the curved oak pieces into a rough arch, hammering the hoops around them with blows he could not hear, only feel through the vibrations in his arm. The entry porch was meant to catch the wind and channel it sideways, away from the door. If he could just get 3 more staves locked, the angle might be enough. His fingers lost sensation. The hammer slipped from his hand once, and he groped in the snow for it, knowing that if he could not find it, he would die out here within minutes. Then his knuckles hit iron. He seized it and kept swinging. Inside the roundhouse, Ada had wrapped Jacob in every blanket they owned. The stove in the center glowed dull orange, but the wind's suction pulled heat from the chimney, making the air taste of cold iron. The curved walls creaked, but not with the splintering sound she expected. It was more like a low groan, a shifting of weight. Snow had already begun piling against the outer curve, but because there were no flat faces to meet the drift, the house did not shudder under accumulated pressure. Instead, the snow seemed to be flowing around them, building a collar at the base and sliding upward in a steep ramp that directed the wind over the roof. Ada could hear a strange new sound above the storm, a hiss, as if the blizzard was skating over them, angry but unable to find a hold. Then the rope went absolutely still. A dead stop. No jerk, no pull, no movement at all. Ada felt the world collapse into that single absence of motion. She screamed Ryan's name into the blast, but the wind tore it away before it passed her lips. She pulled on the rope and it came toward her, offering no resistance. Her heart stopped as she hauled it back, hand over hand, expecting to find a severed end. And then Ryan stumbled through the doorway, coated head to toe in ice, the hammer still clamped in his fist, his face a mask of white. He said nothing. He simply dropped the hammer, fell to his knees, and gasped. The entry porch had held. The door was no longer a wound in the storm's side. It was a throat that the wind could not swallow. The roundhouse was complete, and the blizzard had just been turned away from its first real attempt to murder them. For 3 more days the storm raged without mercy. The temperature outside plunged so low that water thrown into the air would freeze before it hit the ground. Inside the roundhouse, the family lived in a reduced world, a circle of warmth no wider than a man could walk in 10 paces. They measured time by the stove's hunger, by the number of split staves Ryan fed into the fire, by the steady breathing of Jacob asleep in Ada's lap. The curved walls, once a joke to the settlers, became an unexpected ally. The wind that hammered the plains at 60 miles an hour would strike the smooth oak, lose its linear force, break into smaller currents that spiraled harmlessly around the structure before rejoining beyond. It was the same principle a teardrop uses to slip through air, the same shape a river stone becomes after centuries of tumbling. Ryan had stumbled upon aerodynamics decades before the word existed. But the real revelation came on the 4th morning, when the wind finally died and a bruised gray silence settled over the cannonball. Ryan dug his way out through the entry porch and climbed up onto the snow to look around. What he saw made him stop breathing. A drift wall, immense and curving, stood exactly 22 feet from the house on all sides, creating a perfect crescent moon of packed snow. The roundhouse sat in the calm center of that crescent like an open eye in a hurricane, its walls bare, the ground around it swept almost clean by the redirected wind. Beyond the drift wall, the rest of the world was buried under 4 feet of hardpack. The neighbors' sod houses, which had looked so sensible, were now invisible mountains. But Ryan's round house, the folly of the settlement, had forced the blizzard to build its own shelter around it. Nature had done the labor for him. People did not come immediately. It took 2 more days before the trails were broken enough for travel, but when they came in a slow procession of disbelief. First was Cranston, the dry goods merchant who had laughed from his wagon. He stood at the edge of the drift wall, looked at the bare spot where the house sat, and said nothing for a full minute. Then he turned to Ryan and asked, "How much for you to build me one?" That was the moment Ryan understood the idea had outgrown his own survival. It now belonged to everyone on the plains who had spent too many winters terrified of a shape they couldn't see. Because wind is invisible and fear is not, and the roundhouse had made visible a truth that had killed countless men before. The storm does not hate you. It just hates corners. By the time the snow began to melt in patches, the entire settlement had heard the story. Most still did not believe it entirely. Stories got bigger in the retelling, and a house that survived a blizzard was easy to exaggerate. But then the stranger arrived, and the truth of Ryan's roundhouse became impossible to ignore. The stranger was Gideon Mulder, the same bankrupt cooper who had sold Ryan the condemned barrels for $6. He had spent the winter in a boarding house in Bismarck, drinking away the last of his money, waiting for nothing. When he heard the rumors about a roundhouse that had turned a Dakota blizzard into a snow fence, he dismissed them at first. But something nagged at him. He remembered the exact look in Ryan's eyes when he had bought the barrels. Not foolishness, certainty. And so Gideon rode out in the spring, expecting to find a ruined heap of failed staves. What he found instead was a perfectly intact structure with a family living in it, and about 20 of his old barrel hoops still holding the walls tight. Gideon walked around the roundhouse slowly, touching the joints, studying the way the staves had been shaved to interlock, how the roof had been domed instead of peaked, how the entry porch deflected wind like a river dam redirecting current. He was a barrel maker, a man who had spent his life understanding the strength of circles, and he saw immediately that Ryan had not built a house. He had built a horizontal barrel engineered for a different kind of pressure. That was the pivot. That was the moment when a failed cooper and a mocked homesteader stood together in the meltwater of a just-past winter and realized they were holding the design for something that could change settlement on the plains forever. "I can make the staves faster than you can dream them," Gideon said quietly. "We'll sell round houses to every family that fears the winter." And Ryan, who had only wanted to keep his own family alive, looked at the salesman's fire in the old man's eyes and understood that the real work had not even begun. They started without money, without lumber, without even a proper workshop. The old cooperage, which had been stripped bare by creditors, was released for a handful of promises. Gideon had kept his joinery tools hidden from the bankruptcy auction, and those tools, drawn knives, adzes, chisels, hoop drivers, became the foundation of their enterprise. The first barrel house they built on spec was for a Swedish family named Lindquist, who had lost 2 children to a blizzard 3 winters earlier. They were willing to gamble on a shape. Ryan and Gideon worked through the summer, cutting fresh oak hauled by wagon from the Missouri breaks, shaving each stave by hand, assembling the curved walls with the same iron hoops that had once held whiskey. When the frame went up in a single week, faster and cheaper than any plank cabin, the Lindquist stood inside the unfinished circle and felt something that no square room had ever given them. A stillness, a dead calm in the air, even with the prairie wind gusting outside. The roundhouse did not fight the wind. It taught the wind to leave. But the partnership was not just about carpentry. It was about 2 men who had each gambled everything on an idea that the world considered insane. Gideon had lost his business to progress, and Ryan had nearly lost his family to hubris. Together, they had a story that sold more houses than any blueprint ever could. When the first winter came after their commercial enterprise began, they had orders for 11 roundhouses scattered across 3 counties. And then the true test arrived. A blizzard worse than the one Ryan had survived. A 50-year storm that buried wagons under 20-foot drifts and froze cattle standing in the fields. The roundhouses were now scattered across the territory, each one a bet placed by a family that had chosen belief over mockery. If even one of those houses failed, the dream would die. And so, as the sky turned iron-gray once more, and the first hard wind screamed down from the north, Ryan and Gideon stood in the doorway of their newest construction, a round house for a family named Harlow who had laughed at them until the moment the ice started falling, and watched the storm roll in, knowing that the next 3 days would decide whether the barrel house was a miracle of frontier ingenuity or just another footnote in the long history of dead ideas. The blizzard hit the Harlows' round house first, because their claim sat on the northernmost edge of the settlement, fully exposed to the wind's longest run. For the first 12 hours, the structure behaved exactly as Ryan had predicted. The curved walls shed the wind in spiraling currents, and the drift piled up in a neat crescent 20 feet out, leaving the entry porch clear. Elsa Harlow, who had spent the previous winter buried so deep they had to tunnel out through a window, sat by the central stove with her 2 daughters and listened to the storm with something she had never felt during a blizzard before: hope. Her husband, Carl, kept touching the walls, pressing his palm flat against the smooth oak as if expecting to feel a splintering give. But the wood only groaned softly, a sound more like a ship settling into a gentle sea than a house fighting for its life. By the second morning, Carl dared to open the door and look out. The drift wall stood exactly where Ryan had said it would, and the sky beyond was a bright, painful white. He laughed into the wind, and the sound was swallowed, but the laugh was not for the storm. It was for the 900 square miles of frozen prairie that had finally met a shape it could not kill. But 2 miles south, at the Lindquist place, the round house was in trouble. The design was the same, the staves from the same oak, the iron hoops cinched by the same hands. Yet something was different. Nils Lindquist, the father who had already buried 2 children, had made a small modification without telling Ryan. He believed the entry porch, which Ryan had angled to catch the wind from the north, should face east instead, toward the morning sun. He thought it would make the house brighter, warmer. He had not understood that the angle was not about comfort, it was about deflection. So when the storm's full force came screaming down from the north, it did not meet the angled throat of the entry porch. It met a flat opening that faced the wrong direction. The wind crammed itself into that doorway like a flood into a broken levee, and the pressure inside the round house changed instantly. The stove pipe rattled loose. A cold so absolute and violent poured through the living space that it extinguished the fire in seconds. Nils tried to stuff blankets into the doorway, but the wind tore them from his hands. His wife, Ingrid, screamed for the children, but the 2 surviving ones, a boy of 4 and an infant, were already fatting into the gray of hypothermia. Ryan and Gideon, who had taken shelter in the original roundhouse with Ada and Jacob, knew nothing of this. They had spent the night listening to the wind with the calm of men who had already tested their theory. But on the third day, when the blizzard finally broke and the world emerged white and still, a rider came hard from the south. It was Carl Harlow, his face torn by cold and grief. He brought news that cut through Ryan like a saw blade. The Lindquist house had failed. The boy was dead. The infant was barely alive, and Ingrid had lost fingers to the frost. Nils Lindquist was sitting in the snow outside his ruined round house, staring at the door that faced east, refusing to speak. The news traveled across the settlement faster than the thaw. By sundown, a crowd had gathered outside the cooperage where Ryan and Gideon were building their next house. Some held shovels. Some held nothing but rage. A man named Tolliver, whose brother had died in a blizzard years before, stepped forward and pointed a shaking finger at Ryan. "You sold them a coffin," he spat. "You sold them a circle instead of a wall, and now a child is dead because you told them the wind couldn't find a corner." Crowd pressed closer. Ada stood in the doorway of the cooperage, Jacob behind her, and for the first time since the idea had been born, Ryan saw not wonder in the eyes of his neighbors but murder. Gideon stepped between the crowd and Ryan before the first shovel could swing. The old cooper, who had once been a laughingstock himself, straightened his back and raised a hand. His voice was cracked but steady. "The round house that failed," he said, "was not the one we built. The man changed the angle of the porch. He turned it away from the storm's mouth. You can blame the design, but you cannot blame the design for what someone does to it in secret." The crowd faltered, but Tolliver was not satisfied. "Then prove it," he said. Prove the shape works when it's built right. And Gideon looked at the sky, which was already beginning to gather its next assault, and said, We'll build one more, and we'll put it exactly where the next storm will hit hardest. If it fails, you can burn every round house in the cooperage with them." That night in the freezing dark, Ryan and Gideon took apart the failed Lindquist house and studied what had gone wrong. The answer was not just the porch angle. It was the doorway's relationship to the wind's laminar flow. The round house worked because the curved walls forced the wind to accelerate around them, creating a low-pressure zone in front of the porch that pulled the current sideways. But when the porch faced east, that low-pressure zone disappeared, and the wind saw the door as a vacuum to be filled. The entire structure had been turned from a deflector into a funnel. Ryan realized that the entryway was not just a feature, it was the keystone of the entire principle. Without the correct orientation, the round house was not a shelter, it was a trap. Now he had to convince the community that this single devastating failure had actually made the design stronger, because it had revealed a vulnerability no one had seen before. They rebuilt the Lindquist house in 3 days, this time with a porch angled precisely 32 degrees northwest, the optimal deflection measured from Ryan's own house. The staves were cut from the same oak, but the iron hoops were doubled around the door frame, creating a reinforced throat that would not flex under pressure. And then, because the challenge had been public, they built a second round house on the edge of town, in a location everyone agreed was the most exposed claim in the county, the Tolliver place. The same Tolliver who had called for vengeance. He had lost a brother to a drift 10 years earlier, and he had built nothing but contempt for round houses. But when Gideon offered to build one on his land for free, with the whole settlement watching, Tolliver could not refuse without admitting he was afraid of the truth. So the 2 round houses stood waiting, one at the Lindquist claim and one at the Tolliver claim, as the next storm rolled in from the north. This storm was worse. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero before noon, and the wind carried ice shards that cut exposed skin like glass. But Ryan and Gideon were not inside this time. They had made a decision that shocked even Ada. They would ride out the blizzard inside the Tolliver roundhouse, alongside the man who had wanted them dead, to prove that the design would hold. If it failed, they would die with their work. If it survived, the entire settlement would have witnessed the proof from the inside. The first night inside the Tolliver house was a test of nerve beyond anything Ryan had experienced in his original home. The wind was louder here, the claim higher, the exposure absolute. But as the hours passed and the curved walls groaned without breaking, Tolliver began to change. He watched the men who had placed their lives inside his claim, and the hatred in his eyes slowly eroded. By the second morning, he had made coffee over the stove, weak, bitter coffee, and handed a cup to Ryan without speaking. That small gesture was the moment the community began to believe again. And then, on the 3rd day, the storm broke, and the roundhouse stood perfectly intact with a drift wall encircling it like a fortress. The Lindquist house with its corrected porch had also survived. The experiment had worked. When the community rode out to inspect both houses, they found something that even Ryan had not expected. The drift wall around the Tolliver house had formed not as a crescent, but as a complete ring, burying the structure in a bowl of snow with only the roof dome visible. Inside, the temperature had stayed 30 degrees warmer than outside without a fire during the final night. The roundhouse had not just deflected the wind, it had captured a pocket of dead air that acted like insulation. The snow itself had become part of the shelter, just as it does in an igloo, and the prairie wind had unknowingly built a perfect thermal barrier around the occupants. This was the discovery that moved the roundhouse from a curiosity to a necessity. Because it meant that a family could survive a Dakota winter with half the firewood, half the exposure, and none of the fear that came from a square wall groaning under its accumulated burden. Orders poured in, not just from the Cannonball settlement, but from ranches and claims as far west as the Little Missouri. The price of a roundhouse was half that of a plank cabin, and the staves could be transported by wagon in nested bundles, flat-packed like the barrels they had once been. Gideon's old creditors, who had stripped his cooperage, suddenly wanted to renegotiate. The railroad, which had driven him to bankruptcy, now offered to ship his barrel staves to towns that had never heard of a circular house. And Ryan, the man who had started it all with 50 condemned barrels and $6, found himself standing in front of maps that charted the entire northern plains, marking claims that could become roundhouse communities. The folly had become a frontier industry. But the final twist was not about business. It was about the shape itself, and a truth that even Ryan had not fully grasped until an old trapper named Hoke rode in from the mountains with a message that would change everything. Hoke, the same man who had warned about the north-facing door, had spent the winter in the high country, living in a round shelter of his own making. He had not used oak staves or iron hoops. He had used packed snow blocks cut from the drifts. He had built an igloo, a shape known to the Arctic peoples for centuries, and he had survived a winter that killed men in cabins all around him. He looked at Ryan's round houses and said, "You didn't invent anything new. You just remembered what the northern people have always known. A circle is the only shape the wind can't kill. It's the square that's the experiment, and the square has been failing us for 10,000 years." That was the moment the round house stopped being a gimmick and became a philosophical truth, a shape that connected a bankrupt cooper's barrels to the oldest survival architecture on the continent. And as the winter of 1879 gave way to spring, Ryan and Gideon prepared to take that shape down the Missouri River on flatboats, to sell not just houses, but the idea that humanity had been building against the wind wrong for its entire civilized history. In April of 1880, Ryan and Gideon loaded the first commercial shipment onto a flatboat at the Cannonball Landing. 60 bundles of barrel staves, each piece numbered and shaped, along with iron hoops and a hand-drawn diagram showing the exact porch angle. The Missouri River ran high with spring snowmelt, its current fast enough to carry them downstream without a sail. Gideon stood at the tiller, a new leather ledger tucked inside his coat, while Ryan lashed the bundles tighter against the rocking of the deck. They were headed to Yankton, where a Swedish farming settlement had already sent a deposit for 10 round houses. The journey was not just commerce. It was a pilgrimage, a slow float toward the very civilization that had laughed at condemned barrels and now was about to pay real money to live inside them. When the flatboat nudged the landing at Yankton, a crowd had gathered. Word had traveled ahead, carried by traders and drifters. People wanted to see the two men who claimed they could build a house the wind could not kill. Gideon, ever the showman, unloaded the first bundle of staves and began assembling them in the town square. No nails, no frame, just curved oak locking into itself like the ribs of a great wooden whale. By sundown, the walls were up. By noon the next day, the domed roof was in place, and the porch angled precisely 32 degrees northwest. The crowd, which had begun as skeptical, ended the day by pressing forward with orders. They had seen the shape become a shelter, and they had heard the story of the boy who died in the one that faced the wrong direction. That truth hung in the air like a warning, and every family that placed an order afterward demanded the diagram be followed exactly. No one would ever turn a round house door east again. Over the next 5 years, the barrel house movement spread along the Missouri and its tributaries like water finding its own level. The Harlow family, whose round house had survived that second great blizzard, turned their home into a way station for travelers crossing the northern plains. A sign hung above their door read, "The wind goes around here." Carl Harlow would tell the story to anyone who stopped, and every retelling added a layer of wonder until the round house became less a building and more a legend. The Tolliver House, the one built on the most exposed claim in the county, became a community meeting place. Tolliver himself, the man who had once called for Ryan's blood, was now its fiercest defender. He stood at the door during storms, calling in lost travelers, and not a single person who sheltered inside that circle ever died of the cold. The Lindquists took longer to heal. Nils Lindquist had carried the guilt of his modification through every frozen sunrise. But when the corrected roundhouse held firm, and his infant daughter grew stronger each month, something shifted in him. He became a carpenter's apprentice under Gideon, learning the joinery that made the staves interlock perfectly. The son who had survived, a boy named Per, grew up with a draw knife in his hand, and one day he would build round houses of his own. Ingrid, whose fingers had been lost to the frost, never again had to fear the sound of wind against walls. She died an old woman, surrounded by grandchildren, in the same round house that had once nearly become their tomb. The circle, which had taken one child, ultimately saved the rest. Ada gave birth to their daughter in the original round house during a gentle snowfall in late December of 1880. They named her Mary, and the first sound she heard outside the womb was not a howling gale but a soft, steady hiss, the wind slipping around the curved walls, tamed into a lullaby. Jacob, now 8 years old, held his sister in the light of the central stove and understood for the first time that the house his father had built was not just a shelter. It was a promise. A promise that the prairie could not break. Gideon Mulder, the bankrupt cooper who had sold 50 condemned barrels for $6, never saw a poor day again. The roundhouse made him a respected man. He wore a good coat, bought back his original cooperage free and clear, and hired a crew of apprentices to keep up with the orders pouring in from as far west as the Bighorn Mountains. He died in 1887, sitting at his workbench with a stave across his knees, the same way he had spent every meaningful day of his life. His ledger, the one he had bought for that first flatboat journey, contained the names and locations of 212 roundhouses built in 7 years. At his funeral, the preacher said that Gideon had spent his early years making vessels that held whiskey, and his later years making vessels that held families. The difference, the preacher noted, was not in the shape of the wood but in the shape of the man holding it. The original roundhouse on Ryan's claim stood for more than half a century. By 1892, the Department of Agriculture had taken notice of the Dakota barrel houses. They published a bulletin titled Circular Stormproof Dwellings for the Great Plains, with diagrams copied directly from Gideon's ledger and a full account of the blizzard that had proven the design. The bulletin became one of the most requested publications in the homesteading territories, spreading the roundhouse to places its inventors had never seen. Ryan himself, now graying and slower, sometimes rode out to distant settlements to see the houses built from those government instructions, and every time he found the same thing: a curved wall shedding the wind, a crescent drift wall standing 22 feet out, and a family living in a pocket of still air that should not have existed on the open prairie. But there was one detail in the government bulletin that always went overlooked, and yet it contained the deepest truth of all. The author, a young engineer from the land-grant college at Ames, had tested various models in a wind tunnel, a new invention at the time, and discovered that the roundhouse did not merely deflect the wind. It created a standing pressure differential. The wind rushing around the curve actually pulled the air downward, pressing the house into the ground with greater force than the storm's own lift could counteract. The building did not just survive the storm, it used the storm's own energy to anchor itself deeper. It was, the engineer wrote, the same principle that would someday allow airplanes to fly and bridges to span impossible distances. The roundhouse had accidentally discovered aerodynamics decades before the word entered common language. Hoke, the old trapper who had seen an igloo and recognized the shape, had been more right than he knew. The circle was not just a shelter. It was a machine for converting violence into stability. Ryan outlived Gideon by 20 years, and in that time he saw the roundhouse become a fixture of the plains, as common in some counties as the sod huts they had replaced. He died in the same room where Ada had pulled him back from the blizzard with a rope, with his daughter Mary holding his hand and the sound of the wind moving harmlessly outside. On the day of his burial, a storm rolled in from the north, hard and fast, and the mourners took cover in the round house that had started it all. They sat in silence, listening to the familiar hiss, and some of them smiled because they understood that the wind had come to pay its respects, and it still had no corners to find. The legacy of the barrel house did not end with Ryan's death. When the Second World War erupted, and the military needed radar stations in the Arctic. A young engineer who had grown up in a Dakota roundhouse remembered the shape. He helped design the first radomes, spherical structures that shed ice and wind exactly as the prairie shelters had. And when the Apollo lunar lander needed a module that could withstand the blast of a rocket launch, its engineers turned to the same aerodynamic curves that a bankrupt cooper and a stubborn homesteader had hammered out of condemned whiskey barrels a lifetime earlier. The principle never changed. The wind could not kill a circle. So the question that echoes across all these years is not simply whether Ryan was brilliant or lucky. The deeper question is why it took a man with no money and no lumber to remember what the indigenous peoples of the Arctic had known for millennia, what the river stones had demonstrated for eons, what the wind itself had been trying to teach the square-minded settler. That survival on the frontier was never about building a stronger wall. It was about building the shape that the storm had no vocabulary for. Was Parker Vail, no, Ryan, a genius, or was he merely one of the few men willing to shut up and listen to what the blizzard had been screaming all along?